Continuing with Brent Allen Winter's Declaration of 76, United States Constitution, a common lawyer's comments clause by clause, pages 22 to 29. To continue, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Comment. The phrases absolute tyranny used in this clause and absolute despotism used in the previous clause mean enslavement. Much of our Declaration's language is taken from the First Continental Congress's first meeting on 14 October 1774. Resolving that the acts of King and Parliament demonstrate a system formed to enslave America. Unlike the civil law tradition, which elevates law, its code, over facts, our Declaration is fact-driven. The facts of a matter, says our common law, reveal the applicable law, not the other way around. For 166 years before our Declaration, Parliament had left her American colonies alone because during the 17th century, Parliament was occupied with trying to keep the Crown from overreaching its common law limits. Contention gathered, swelling into full-pitched war, ending with Parliament's victory, but resulting in British migrations to Britain's land claims in America. During this prosperity, Parliament and its kings paid little mind to the American colonies. Accordingly, the colonies grew strong in numbers, wealthy in trade, prospering beyond measure. However, the British Americans' freewheeling and intrepid ways and manners frightened Britain's German king, George III. In addition, Europe's bankers, exploiting the fears following England's 16th century internal war, had set up their central bank in England. King George was one of its chief beneficiaries. Consequently, he persuaded the then split Parliament, albeit according to his German, not English sensibilities, competing for his loyalty, to help him get control of the colonies. George misunderstood that common law is against monopolies, demanding that government never interfere with or chill common law's freedom of association, which includes freedom of disassociation and to associate by contract, i.e. the law of promises, and freedom of choice of currency. In short, George blundered. Europe's central bank shareholders lost the American colonies with their monopoly of banking and trade in those colonies. Number 3. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Comment. Unlike common law government, civil law is imperial, administered from a far-off central command, sending swarms of bureaucrats to force its will. Thus, it spurns local representative bodies. Our Declaration's clauses 3 to 10 decries the King's decree from afar, which denied the right to local legislative representation, including those representatives' right to set up common law courts with trial by jury. Placing himself above personal rights, King George ignored this common law duty. Clause 4. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. Comment. For the reasons our Declaration here states, our Constitution includes its 10-day rule and pocket veto. See U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 7, Clause 2. Consequently, the executive president ignores Congress and its proposed legislation at peril of his power. If after 10 days he has failed to veto legislation sent to him for his signature by setting out his reasons, it becomes law. Thus does this Clause 4 cite a first principle of common law government, the one charged to exercise discretion. The just power to say yes or no must do so. To ignore this duty is to trample upon individual rights. Clause 5. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Comment. Here, the colonists charged the king with refusing whole land areas of Americans our common law's protection, including courts and trial by jury, unless they knuckled under taxation without their right to local legal representatives. Thus, the signers declare that the mother country has violated common law's separation of powers principle. In this instance, by the executives, the king's meddling with the legislature. The king, by refusing to annex whole areas of new settled wilderness until the inhabitants agreed to give up their right of sending representatives to their legislature, held them hostage. British at heart, the colonists' mindset was fixed in the tradition of centuries of Anglo-Dane custom that the people choose their king from among their kith and kin. That king, in turn, was duty-bound to appoint judges, shire reeves, sheriffs, meaning county agents, and bailiffs to summon jurors. In short, the king was to put the machinery of courts in place and then stay out of the court's business. Americans later, pushing beyond the frontier, set up their own common law courts without waiting on governments back east to do so. In time, state and federal courts ratified the findings of these local courts. Examples abound. In fact, Americans learned that the meddling of a far-fetched government in their local courts thwarted the due process that arose among them by nature, i.e., through courts of common consensus, juries. Nowhere is the natural arising of common law courts, juries, and due process better seen than among the mining districts from the tin fields of Cornwall to Spain and from the gold fields of Georgia to California, where unlearned yet able men all arrived at the same first principles of common law and government. See Brent Allen Winters, Excellence of the Common Law, Application 1. Clause 6. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Comment. As much as possible, people must keep their legislatures and also their courts close and accessible. Keeping in mind, however, that closeness, though better enabling accessibility, never ensures it. Without question, distant courts and legislatures are inaccessible. But even if these are nearby, they may still be, for example, an undue fear of terrorists. Hypersecurity at American courthouses has made courts inaccessible. When a central distant power hinders local government, the people must conduct local courts using the jury. By setting up common law courts at more local levels, America will have that which Blackstone cites as the peculiar strength of the early Anglo-Saxons. Jurors as judges impaneled at every level and locality, from the manor courts of the village neighborhoods and the 100 courts of the countrysides to the shire moats, county courts, and royal courts. By these, says Blackstone, courts were handy close by every cottage. See also today, Americans must impanel the jury in their church assemblies, townships, villages, cities, water districts, and irrigation districts. In order to keep courts accessible, charters of such smaller local government must empower the impaneling of the jury according to the course of the common law, including appointment of local bailiffs with duties akin to justices of the peace to oversee fair play in impaneling of the jury. Local court authority must arise direct from the jury, ensuring trial by jury, not by government. Clause 7. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Comment. Here, our declaration again charges the king, executive power, with ignoring common law's separation of powers by interfering with the legislative powers, dissolving local legislatures. In the common law tradition, each of the three powers of government, legislative, legislators of law in general for the future, executive, enforcer of law in the present, and judicial interpreter applier of law in specific cases in hindsight of the past, are under duty to keep each of the other two powers from encroaching or otherwise usurping its office. It is necessary to good government by the English Constitution that the branches be independent of each other, that therefore the exercise of the legislative power in these colonies by the Crown is unconstitutional, dangerous, and destructive to freedom. First Continental Congress, 14 October 1774. To be sure, these three powers or branches of government must stem from the same common law constitutional tree, depending on that common source for authority and never upon each other. In short, each branch must keep independent of the other and dependent upon our Constitution's common law principles. Unlike Roman civil law, common law recognizes that though we must live life forwards, we only understand life only by looking back, and therefore uses the jury's judicial power in hindsight of facts. Indeed, the future is speculation. Hindsight is 20/20. Clause 8. He is refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. Comment. Among the foremost legislative powers of common law government are taxation, common defense, and coining money. Here, our declaration charges the king not with destroying the legislative power, an utter impossibility, because the Creator has given it to the people and inextricably bound it up with the image of God in each person, but with keeping those powers of the militia, the people, level, and by force keeping them from mustering for the common defense under the Constitution and their legislature's regulation. Rulers that bar the people from choosing officers and mustering as the armed militia to protect their families, their neighbors, their property, and their country force the people to trust rulers for their defense. Such rulers history calls tyrants, as also does this Declaration of 76. Clause 9. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. Comment. Underlying all of the common law traditions is the law of the land, or, as Magna Carta calls it, land law, lex terrae, because its roots and rights arise from property rights in land use. Because the common law grew among farmers and miners, its principles are foremost seen in the individual's lordship, stewardship over land, his rights in property, and his property in those rights. By contrast, the civil law tradition is about government lording it over people. Thus, civil law-minded government will permit entry onto uninhabited land only when it can dominate those entering. See example Brent Allen Winter's Excellence of the Common Law application 1, discussing Congress's alarm at being unable to dominate California prospectors and miners. In fact, the word territory comes from the civil law tradition, signifying that land area over which Rome extended her terror. Civil law government dominates and controls through terrorism the inciting fear of others or that of government itself. At common law, any government that tries to bar or hinder inhabitation and profitable use of that country's uninhabited and dormant land flies in the face of God. Land is God's blessing to mankind. By it, he can live. Without it, he dies. Consequently, God wills that his uninhabited earth or land be always open to entry and good stewardship, because the land and its wealth are his. In fact, by first principle of the common law and scripture, the landowner that neglects to put his land to good use must yield it to the one aggressive enough to do so. Thus, says Moynihan, the common law recognizes adverse possession, that strange and wonderful teaching which encourages production to the good of all. By this same principle, America's Homestead Law of 1862 opened her inhabited tillable lands. Her Mining Law of 1872 was opened her mineral lands. Virgin land in most of the colonies was available clean to the Mississippi, but as Nimrod at Babylon, King George and his cronies wanted the colonists crowded close along the seaboard, handy for ease of fleecing through their tax-supported trading and banking monopolies. As did King George, the general government is now ever more raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. Using hyper-detailed administrative codes, its bureaucrats keep farmers from farming their land, bar new lands from being formed, and make mining of new claims impossible. Administrative law codes are the pretended legislation of our Declaration's Clause 15, such of which Christ showed the deepest hatred against its bureaucrats. He delivered his most stabbing words of doom. See example Matthew 23 verse 4, chapters 13 to 15. Oh no, these are all same verses. Chapter 23 verses 4, 13 to 15, 23, 25, 27, 29, and then Luke chapter 11, 46.